The morning sun was just beginning to burn away the cool air over Denver International Airport as passengers filed through the jet bridge toward Flight 247. It was an ordinary Thursday, the kind that blended into countless others. Travelers hurried. Along, some clutching coffee cups, some dragging roller bags, others fumbling with boarding passes. Nothing about the scene suggested history was about to unfold. At the front of the line, a young mother coaxed her toddler forward, balancing, a diaper bag on one shoulder and a stuffed rabbit in her free hand. Behind her, a man in a sharp navy suit checked his watch repeatedly, impatience written across his face. He was flying to New York for a business deal he'd been preparing months for. 3 college students laughed as they carried backpacks, filled with snacks and headphones, eager for a weekend adventure. Captain William Reynolds sat in the cockpit, scanning instruments with the practiced ease of a man who had logged more than 20 years in the air. He was calm, steady, methodical, the kind of pilot passengers never thought about, but always trusted. Beside him, First Officer Mark Daniels went through the checklist, reading aloud each item, while Reynolds confirmed with a nod or a flick of a switch. They were a seasoned team, professional and unflappable. "Good day for flying," Daniels said, glancing at the clear skies projected on the radar. "Perfect day," Reynolds replied, his tone easy but focused. He'd flown this route countless times, en route to New York, 4 hours gate to gate, a routine mission as predictable as breathing. Back in the cabin, flight attendants greeted passengers with warm smiles, guiding them to seats and helping with overhead luggage. The hum of boarding chatter filled the space phones ringing, children fussing, bags being shoved into compartments. Row 14 window seat was taken by a woman who moved with deliberate composure. She wore a simple gray cardigan, jeans, and sneakers, unremarkable clothes that allowed her to blend in. A book rested in her lap, though she wasn't reading yet. Instead, she gazed out the window as the ground crew loaded luggage below. Her name wasn't on anyone's lips, nor did anyone pay her much attention. She wasn't the loudest, the most nervous, or the most noticeable passenger. But there was something in the way she sat straight-backed, unhurried, calm that set her apart. While others shifted, sighed, or scrolled endlessly on their phones, she simply breathed, steady and quiet, as though nothing in the world could disturb her. Beside her, a boy no older than 7 sat hugging a toy car. His mother adjusted his seatbelt, distracted as she rummaged in her purse for a snack. The boy stole a glance at the woman by the window, curious about her stillness. She gave him the faintest smile, and though she didn't speak, the boy instantly felt reassured. Announcements crackled overhead as the last few passengers boarded. Luggage doors thudded shut, and the cabin doors were sealed. The engines rumbled to life, sending vibrations through the floor. The plane began its slow taxi toward the runway, and with each passing second, the rhythm of flight settled in the rhythm that made people relax, convinced everything was normal. Captain Reynolds guided the aircraft down the runway, throttling forward until the roar of engines filled the cabin. Passengers pressed into their seats as the plane lifted into the sky, climbing smoothly above the city below. Denver's grid faded into a patchwork of fields, then mountains, then endless clouds. For a moment, peace reigned. Passengers unbuckled seatbelts. A businessman opened his laptop, already typing frantically. The college students swapped playlists and laughed at inside jokes. A retired couple leaned against each other, holding hands as they admired the view. A flight attendant rolled a cart down the aisle, offering drinks with practiced efficiency. Through it all, the woman at the window quietly turned the first page of her book. The boy beside her was mesmerized not by the toy car in his hand, but by her calmness, as if she carried her own weather system of serenity. When the turbulence nudged the plane slightly, passengers gasped, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she marked her page with her finger and adjusted her breathing, slow and measured. In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds adjusted the controls, guiding them eastward. He'd flown during storms, through heavy winds, over mountains cloaked in fog. Today was simple. Today was supposed to be easy. Leveling at 36,000, he said, and Daniels confirmed. Both men relaxed slightly. The calm stretched on. Nothing hinted at what was coming. But while most passengers sank into their routines, movies on tablets, crossword puzzles, conversations, three men seated separately kept glancing around the cabin. They didn't know each other, or at least that's how it appeared. One sat near the front, fidgeting with his hands. Another in the middle aisle leaned forward, eyes darting nervously. The third lingered near the back, head bent, lips moving as if muttering to himself. They were waiting. Waiting for a signal, only they knew. The woman at the window noticed them. Before anyone else did. Noticing was her gift. While others were lost in their worlds, she observed. The man 2 rows ahead who seemed too restless. The one behind her who checked the aisle too often. The other whose knuckles whitened every time. He gripped the seat. They thought they were invisible, but to her, their nervous energy was as loud as an alarm bell. She didn't move. She didn't react. She turned another page in her book, her face betraying nothing. But she filed the details away. Something was off. The flight stretched into its first hour. Drinks were poured, snacks distributed. The hum of conversation dulled into the white noise of travel. For most, it was an ordinary trip. Yet beneath the calm veneer of routine, tension was brewing, unnoticed by nearly everyone except her. Captain Reynolds glanced at the cabin camera, a grainy monitor showing passengers in their seats. Everything appeared normal. He leaned back slightly, sipping his coffee, thinking about the baseball game he planned to watch with his son that weekend. He had no idea how quickly his life and every life aboard was about to change. In row 14, the woman closed her book and rested it on her lap. She looked out the window again, her reflection faint in the glass. She inhaled deeply, slowly, deliberately, as though preparing for something unseen. The boy beside her tugged her sleeve. "Are we almost there?" he whispered. She gave a soft smile. "Not yet," she replied quietly. Her voice carried a steadiness that made the boy relax, even though he didn't understand why. The engines droned on. The sky outside stretched endless and blue. Nothing looked unusual. Nothing felt dangerous. To the average eye, Flight 247 was simply another aircraft crossing America. Another collection of strangers heading to New York. But in less than 20 minutes, terror would walk the aisle. And when it did, the fate of every soul on board would hinge not on weapons or strength, but on the calm of one woman no one had noticed until now. The hum of the engines and the soft murmur of passengers lulled Flight 247 into a sense of normalcy. But tension had been quietly creeping in like a shadow. The three men, scattered throughout the cabin, exchanged subtle nods, their movements deliberate but calculated. They had rehearsed this, or at least imagined rehearsing it countless times in their minds. The scenario of terror that would give them power over a plane full of strangers. Then it happened. The first man sprang from his seat near the front. His movements sharp, unnatural. The cabin's ordinary rhythm shattered instantly. The flight attendant attending that section froze mid-step, a tray of juice wobbling in her hands. Screams erupted from the first few rows as passengers instinctively ducked or raised their arms in panic. "Everyone sit down, now!" The man shouted, voice harsh and urgent. He brandished a small but deadly-looking firearm, pointing it toward the terrified crowd. Heartbeats thundered. Children screamed. Adults froze, staring at the weapon in disbelief. The soft clatter of dropped luggage and crying passengers mingled with the plane's steady drone. Chaos had arrived, slicing through the routine like a knife. A second man, seated in the middle, followed suit. He moved with precision, trying to intimidate, though his shaking hands betrayed fear. "Calm," he barked, voice trembling. "Sit. No one move." His words were less commanding than desperate, and yet the passengers obeyed out of instinct. Survival instinct, raw and immediate, kicked in. The third man, stationed near the back, remained low, scanning the cabin, muttering, under his breath as if counting seconds. Every small gesture the tense clenching of a jaw, the restless tapping of a shoe spoke to the fragile balance between control and panic. Captain Reynolds felt the shift immediately. He gripped the yoke tighter, heart hammering but face set. "Brace yourselves," he murmured to First Officer Daniels. "We have a hijacking." Daniels swallowed hard, eyes wide but focused. "Do you think it's armed?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Yes, definitely armed," Reynolds said, voice low but steady. His mind raced. Protocol dictated he wait, observe, and respond carefully. But he was trained for routine. Hijackings, for known threats, for panic, not for the unknown variables coursing through the cabin right now. Meanwhile, in row 14, the woman by the window remained seated, serene as ever. She observed with clarity, noting every twitch, every nervous glance of the intruders. Her gaze fell upon the boy beside her, wide-eyed and trembling. She put a calm hand on his shoulder. "It's going to be okay," she whispered softly, just loud enough for him to hear. The boy inhaled shakily, drawing reassurance from her. Composure. It was a small act, but in that moment, it sent a ripple of hope across the aisle. Passengers nearby noticed the sudden reduction in panic around her. Some took a shaky breath. Others turned to watch her, curiosity mingling with relief. The hijackers noticed too. Their control relied on chaos, on fear amplified. But this woman refused to comply with their invisible rules. "Move!" one of the men shouted at a passenger trying to rise. But instead of screams or desperate compliance, the man froze, looking toward row 14. Her eyes met his not confrontational, but calm, unwavering. The tension in the cabin thickened. Something subtle, almost imperceptible, was happening. The hijacker's power was beginning to waver. Captain Reynolds seized on this moment. He pressed a discreet button under the control panel, the hijack alert code embedded in the transponder. Air traffic control would now know something was seriously wrong. Fighter jets could be scrambled, but on the plane, no one yet knew the outcome. He had to buy time, protect lives, and plan the impossible. The hijackers, sensing an unexpected pushback from the passengers, became aggressive. One pressed his weapon against a passenger's shoulder. Another waved his arms erratically, shouting instructions in a language most passengers didn't understand. Fearful compliance spread unevenly, some moving quickly, others frozen. The woman did not flinch. Instead, she leaned slightly, scanning the crowd, whispering directions to those nearby. "Stay calm, don't show fear. Keep breathing," she said quietly, almost inaudibly. Yet her tone carried authority and clarity. Passengers instinctively followed. Children stopped crying. Adults straightened, mirroring her posture. The flight attendant near her caught on, subtly signaling others to maintain composure. The plane's interior became an eerie calm amid the storm. The hijackers noticed the shift. One dropped his gaze, shaking slightly. Another muttered in frustration, clearly unprepared for this unexpected resistance. Their confidence, so carefully rehearsed in private rooms and imagined scenarios, began cracking under the influence of a single passenger's steadiness. Reynolds observed from the cockpit. He noticed the subtle cues, the lead hijackers. Eye twitching, the second man gripping the back of a seat for balance, the third whispering frantic instructions to the others. The flight, once routine, was now a battlefield of wills. And yet, remarkably, the battlefield was tilting away from the hijackers. Passengers, emboldened by the woman's calm, exchanged glances. Some subtly coordinated movements, following her unspoken guidance. A man with a briefcase shifted to block an aisle. A nurse clasped her hands, ready to assist if needed. A teenage boy knelt beside a seatbelt buckle, prepared to act if required. Hope was forming, imperceptible yet powerful, in the midst of terror. The lead hijacker, frustrated by the lack of panic, slammed a fist onto an armrest. "Everyone obey!" He barked, but the silence of defiance filled the cabin, louder than any scream could. Passengers who were moments ago petrified now stood just a little taller, inspired by the calm, collected presence in row 14. The woman, noting their frustration, shifted slightly and spoke softly again. "Remember, don't react to them. Watch. Wait. Stay calm." She did not raise her voice, did not threaten, did not confront directly, yet her words carried force. Passengers clutched onto her composure as one clutches a life raft, and the hijacker's panic deepened without even realizing it. In the cockpit, Reynolds adjusted the plane slightly, a small tilt to compensate for the turbulence outside, though inside it felt like the calm before a storm. His mind raced, calculating every possible outcome, weighing every tiny decision. That could mean the difference between survival and disaster. He glanced at Daniels. "They're nervous," he said quietly. "We can use this." "Yes, but we need a plan," Daniels replied, sweat dampening his collar. "We have unarmed passengers. They're not trained. We can't risk sudden chaos." "Agreed," Reynolds murmured. "We wait and we watch." Meanwhile, the hijackers began whispering among themselves. Their aggression, once confident, had turned jittery. Small mistakes were made. One leaned too far. Another dropped a magazine. A third tripped slightly over his own shoelaces. Every minor lapse was noted by the woman and by passengers who had started to mimic her calm. A subtle rhythm emerged in the cabin, a silent choreography of courage. The hijackers expected fear to spread like wildfire. Instead, composure spread like a quiet storm. It was almost imperceptible to anyone outside, but it was shifting the balance. The boy beside the woman finally let out a shaky breath, gripping her sleeve. "Is it really okay?" he whispered. She smiled softly, holding his hand for reassurance. "Yes, we're okay." "Just stay calm," she replied. It was a small gesture, but it reinforced something much larger: the idea that courage could exist even in terror. The plane continued its journey eastward, engines humming, passengers tense. Hijackers panicked in small, subtle ways, and one woman maintained a calm so complete it began to define the cabin. No one noticed time passing, yet every second stretched, heavy with uncertainty. Flight 247 had crossed into a space where routine no longer applied. Each breath, each heartbeat, mattered. By the time the captain reached the halfway point over the Rockies, the hijackers' aggression had grown desperate. They shouted louder, waved weapons more frantically, but their effectiveness was failing. The passengers no longer screamed. They no longer bowed to fear. Their glances toward row 14 carried silent courage. The woman's presence had shifted the invisible energy of the plane, leaving the hijackers exposed, uncertain, and vulnerable. Reynolds pressed a button to slightly adjust cabin altitude, a gentle maneuver that would unsettle the hijackers while keeping passengers safe. Each small motion was deliberate, tactical, each adjustment measured. Every second was a step closer to survival. Somewhere in the back of the plane, one hijacker cursed under his breath, sensing control slipping through his fingers. The woman remained seated, serene, but mentally cataloging every detail, preparing for what might come next. She was ready, though no one around her realized it yet. The quiet, the tension, the observation, and the subtle preparation had set the stage. Flight 247 was no longer a routine journey. It had become a battlefield of psychology, courage, and willpower where calmness was more powerful than any weapon. And in the cockpit, Captain Reynolds knew that their fates rested not only on training, but on the unshakable presence of the woman in row 14. The chaos inside Flight 247 had settled into a strange, tense equilibrium. Screams had subsided into murmurs. Passengers still trembled, but a subtle shift had taken root. Fear no longer dominated. It was replaced with something fragile, yet potent: observation, hope. And it all revolved around the woman in row 14. She had closed her book completely, laying it neatly on her lap. Her posture was straight, shoulders squared, but her movements were unhurried, deliberate. Every gesture, how she placed her hands on her knees, how she shifted her gaze, was intentional, calculated, yet imperceptibly natural. It wasn't the kind of calm that suggested ignorance of danger. On the contrary, she understood it fully. She knew the hijackers' presence, their weapons, their psychological hold over the cabin. She had catalogued them all in the brief span of minutes, noting their patterns, their micro-expressions, the tiny inconsistencies in their confidence. A small boy, the one clutching his toy car, had stopped whimpering. His tiny hand now rested atop hers, as if seeking permission to trust, permission to calm down. "It's going to be okay," she whispered again, more firmly this time, though still quiet. He nodded slightly, inhaling deeply, trying to mimic her steady breathing. Around them, other passengers noticed. Some followed suit unconsciously, straightening in their seats, holding their chests higher, trying to mirror her composed demeanor. The lead hijacker noticed too. His sharp eyes scanned the cabin, expecting faces twisted with terror, trembling, pleading. Instead, he saw something unfamiliar: composure. Row after row, people were holding their ground. Some children no longer cried. Some adults had stopped clutching their arms or frantically checking phones. The hijacker's hand tightened around the weapon, but doubt had begun creeping in, eroding confidence. He exchanged a nervous glance with the man in the middle. The third, near the rear, shifted uneasily. Fear was their weapon, and it was being dismantled quietly, insidiously, by a passenger who had done nothing more than refuse to panic. The woman leaned slightly toward the aisle, glancing briefly at the faces nearest her. She whispered instructions so faint that only those close could hear. "Keep your hands visible. Keep breathing. Look them in the eye if they speak to you." She didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't call attention to herself. Her influence spread silently, a ripple across a panicked ocean. Passengers who caught her gaze felt an unexpected surge of courage. One man, a construction worker, gripped his seatbelt and straightened, willing his shaking legs to steady. A young woman clutched her child, speaking soothingly, repeating the same quiet words she had heard from row 14. A flight attendant, pale and tense, copied her posture and subtly began projecting calm, softening the impact of the hijacker's aggression. The lead hijacker's confidence began to crack. He shouted at a man who was frozen in fear, trying to force him to comply. But the man, buoyed by the collective calm, held his ground. "Do it!" the hijacker barked, raising his weapon. Silence met him. Eyes wide and resolute stared back. That silence was heavier than any scream, more intimidating than any threat. The woman observed carefully. Her calm was not passive. She was assessing, calculating every possibility, every tiny change in the hijacker's behavior. She noticed that the man near the back kept glancing at his partners with uncertainty, and that his foot tapped nervously against the floor. The lead's knuckles whitened as he gripped the armrest. These small, almost imperceptible cracks would matter. Timing, she understood, would be critical. Meanwhile, Captain Reynolds in the cockpit monitored the cabin camera, watching the shifting dynamics unfold. He could see it, even through the grainy feed, the woman's influence spreading. The lead hijacker's posture was changing, subtle but telling, and the passengers nearest row 14 were beginning to mirror her control. Reynolds exhaled slowly. This was the chance he had been waiting for, the opening to stabilize the situation, before it spiraled further out of control. The middle hijacker noticed the lack of panic as well. He muttered under his breath, frustrated that people weren't crumbling as expected. His voice quivered with uncertainty. He expected shrieks, tremors, tears. Instead, he encountered composed faces and quiet, defiant eyes. He had underestimated one passenger and underestimated how quickly calm courage could spread like wildfire. The woman's calm extended beyond psychological influence. She subtly scanned her surroundings, noting potential tools and escape routes, watching for opportunities to protect herself and others. The boy beside her clung a little less to his toy, drawing strength from her presence. She positioned herself slightly forward, ready to shield him if necessary, and her gaze swept the cabin like a lighthouse beam cutting through fog. Passengers were beginning to act in small ways. One elderly man straightened, speaking to the person next to him in a hushed voice. Just stay calm. Follow her lead. Another passenger adjusted a bag to use as a barrier. These minor actions collectively undermined the hijacker's sense of dominance, unnoticeable to anyone who wasn't paying attention to human behavior in extremis. Captain Reynolds used the moment to communicate with air traffic control discreetly, sending subtle codes through the plane's transponder. Outside, fighter jets were alerted, but inside, the flight's survival depended entirely on psychology, courage, and timing. Each second passed with agonizing slowness, heavy with uncertainty. And yet a strange rhythm emerged, chaos, tempered by silent strategy. The hijackers, growing increasingly frustrated, began making mistakes. The lead tripped slightly over a bag, muttering curses under his breath. The man in the middle adjusted his weapon nervously, breathing heavier than necessary. The one at the back whispered frantic instructions the others barely heard. Their coordination was slipping. The woman noted it all, mentally cataloging weaknesses. Her calm was not passive, it was analytical, strategic. Every small crack she noticed in the hijacker's confidence was a potential opportunity. Every ripple of courage spreading through the cabin reinforced her belief that panic could be contained, that people could be rallied without violence, that chaos could be neutralized through sheer presence. The boy beside her whispered, "Mommy?" She smiled faintly, shaking her head. "I'm not your mommy," she said softly, "but I promise we'll get through this. Just breathe." He mimicked her slow inhalation, and for a brief moment, the terror receded in his mind, replaced by trust. Others were doing the same, unconsciously drawing strength from her control. The cabin, once a theater of fear, had become an arena of silent defiance. The hijacker's psychological leverage, which relied entirely on visible panic, was slipping away. Their aggression grew, louder but less effective, and tension coiled tighter in the air. The woman remained the eye of this storm, poised, calculating, unwavering. Captain Reynolds in the cockpit watched every nuance. His mind raced with possibilities, how to stabilize, how to protect, how to prepare for the next move. But he couldn't act recklessly. Untrained passengers were all that stood between survival and catastrophe. Yet seeing the effect of row 14's calm gave him clarity. One person could shift the balance. One person could change the dynamic entirely. Time passed in strange, elastic waves. 1 minute, the hijackers shouted and gestured violently. Next, the cabin was eerily still, everyone holding on to the quiet command of one woman's presence. Sweat beaded on foreheads, hearts thumped with fear and adrenaline, yet the undercurrent of courage persisted. Finally, the lead hijacker slammed his fist against the armrest, shouting for obedience. I said move. He barked. Eyes met his. In defiance, unflinching. The silence that greeted him was deafening. He felt it a shift in power he could neither understand nor control. He glared at his partners, uncertainty growing, panic creeping in at the edges. The woman leaned slightly forward, eyes narrowing as she whispered again. Stay calm. Observe. Wait. Don't react to them. Her voice was quiet, measured, firm, almost imperceptible. Yet it carried authority. Passengers absorbed it. Hey. Boy drew another steady breath, mimicking her. Another passenger straightened. Another glanced toward her, a silent acknowledgement that courage had arrived, quietly, without fanfare. Captain Reynolds exhaled slowly. This was the turning point. Not action yet. Observation, strategy, psychological resilience. The calm, unshakable presence of one woman was changing the dynamics of the entire cabin. And the pilot knew it. From this moment, the passengers had a chance. The woman in row 14 wasn't a soldier, wasn't trained for combat, wasn't carrying a weapon. But she was armed with something more powerful, the ability to control her own fear, and to transmit that control to everyone around her. In that moment, Flight 247 was no longer merely a plane in transit. It was a crucible. And at its center, a single passenger had become the fulcrum of hope. The hum of Flight 247's engines had become almost meditative, a constant reminder of the world outside the cabin. Above the Rockies, the sun glinted against the windows, casting long reflections that danced across the seats. Inside, however, a storm grew far more dangerous than anything in the skies. The hijackers paced, their nerves fraying, while the passengers, inspired by the quiet courage of the woman in row 14, began holding their ground. Captain William Reynolds leaned slightly forward in the cockpit, fingers drumming lightly on the control panel. His jaw was tight, eyes scanning the cabin camera feed. Every twitch of the hijackers, every subtle shift in posture, was being catalogued. He had been trained for hijackings, for mechanical failures, for severe weather. But this situation was different. He wasn't dealing with panic or chaos in the usual sense. He was observing a unique, psychological shift that could be leveraged if he acted with precision. Reynolds' gaze returned to the woman in row 14. She sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, observing, instructing, and guiding without ever raising her voice. The passengers around her mirrored her calm, and the effect was palpable. Even the lead hijacker had noticed. His aggressive posturing had slowed, replaced by quick, nervous glances toward her. "Mark," Reynolds whispered to his co-pilot, "watch this. She's doing what training never taught me. She's controlling them without moving." Daniels nodded, sweat beading on his forehead. "It's remarkable. How is she doing that?" Reynolds didn't answer. He didn't need to. He had observed the cabin's dynamic shifting for several minutes. The hijackers' grip was weakening, their aggression ineffective, and the passengers' panic was fading. Every second was a chance, but timing would be critical. One wrong move could unleash chaos instantly. Reynolds leaned back slightly, considering options. A direct confrontation was out of the question. He could not risk a maneuver that might send untrained passengers into sudden panic. Negotiation was risky, but necessary. He needed to buy time, to wait until the hijackers were destabilized enough for a safe intervention. And he needed the passengers quiet, calm, ready, steady. he murmured to Daniels. "We're not flying yet. We wait. Watch." Back in the cabin, the woman's subtle instructions continued. She whispered to those nearby, guiding their posture, their breathing, their gaze. Passengers straightened, copied her movements, and exchanged small, reassuring nods. Fear, once a tidal wave, had become a ripple. Children stopped crying, adults stopped trembling, and even some of the hijackers' peers noticed the shift. The lead hijacker, frustrated, slammed a fist against the armrest. "Move!" he shouted. He waved his weapon aggressively, demanding obedience. But the cabin was still, silent, tense, observing. Panic had lost its power. The woman leaned slightly forward, whispering to a man near the aisle. "Watch them. Don't react. Hold your hands where they can see. Breathe." Her tone was calm but commanding. He nodded, doing exactly as she instructed, and for a moment the lead hijacker faltered. His control, built on terror, was slipping. Captain Reynolds recognized the moment immediately. His mind raced. This was the opening he needed, but it would require subtlety. Any overt maneuver from the cockpit might provoke immediate violence. The goal now was to manipulate the psychological balance, giving the passengers the courage to maintain composure while buying time for external intervention. He pressed a few discrete buttons on the control panel, subtly adjusting altitude by a few degrees. The plane banked slightly, imperceptible to most passengers, but enough to unbalance the hijackers momentarily. The man near the middle stumbled over his seat, his weapon wavering. The lead's eyes widened, realizing the plane wasn't as steady as he expected. The woman observed the subtle shift instantly, adapting her instructions. "Steady," she whispered. To those around her, "Watch, don't react, hold fast." A ripple of control spread. Passengers gripped armrests, legs planted firmly, breathing slow and deliberate. Even the young boy beside her copied her method, inhaling deeply, exhaling calmly. It was remarkable the transformation was visible, almost cinematic. Fear had not disappeared entirely, but courage had begun to seat itself in the cabin. The hijackers' frustration grew. Their shouting escalated, but it lacked efficacy. Commands were ignored or met with silent compliance. Their confidence eroded with every second of defiance, every still passenger, every small act of resistance that came without confrontation. Reynolds adjusted the plane slightly again, this time banking a little left to maintain heading while subtly affecting the hijacker's stance. Their balance faltered. The middle hijacker's grip tightened on his weapon, knuckles whitening, heart racing. The one near the rear muttered incoherently, the first sign of panic in his voice. The lead, noticing the hesitation of his partners, raised his voice even louder, trying to reassert control, but his words carried no weight. The woman in row 14 stood now, just a little, enough to project presence without drawing attention. Her movements were calculated, confident, unhurried. She whispered instructions to the nearest passengers. "Keep calm, stay grounded, watch the others, one at a time." Those passengers complied, reinforcing the silent pattern of courage. Reynolds observed every subtle detail, noting which passengers were ready, which could be moved safely, and which needed reassurance. The next step was delicate. A misjudgment could provoke violence. He needed to maintain the psychological advantage, keep the hijackers off balance, and buy enough time for fighter jets to arrive. A child whined softly, breaking the momentary silence. The woman leaned down, placing her hand gently on his shoulder. "It's okay. We're calm. We'll get through this," she murmured. His sobs stopped. Other children observed, drawing strength from her composure. The cabin's collective anxiety began to transform into shared, quiet vigilance. The lead hijacker cursed under his breath, noticing that the cabin was no longer cowering. His authority depended on fear. The moment fear disappeared, his power waned. He gestured wildly, barking orders that went unheeded, his voice quivering now, exposing cracks in the mask of confidence. Reynolds' mind raced. The moment was almost ready. He could make subtle adjustments in altitude, in tilt, to further destabilize the hijackers without alarming the passengers. Each adjustment required precision and careful timing. Each second passed with the weight of countless possibilities. The woman remained the anchor. She guided the passengers, whispered softly, moved slightly to shield vulnerable passengers, and scanned the cabin with unblinking awareness. Her calm had become infectious, a force more potent than the weapons the hijackers wielded. The planes. Slight banking caused the lead hijacker to stumble slightly, catching himself on the armrest. The middle man dropped his weapons slightly as his balance faltered. The rear hijacker muttered frantically to his colleagues. Reynolds saw the exact moment control had shifted just enough to act without provoking a massacre. He leaned back, slightly in the cockpit, readying for the next subtle maneuvers. Fighter jets had been alerted. External support was en route. But inside the cabin, the survival of every passenger depended entirely on maintaining composure. Every decision, every movement, every whisper mattered. The woman glanced at the passengers. Around her, eyes met hers with a spark of understanding. Fear had not vanished, but courage was spreading silently, strategically. It was almost imperceptible, yet powerful enough to tilt the balance. For Reynolds, this was the defining moment. He realized that this ordinary woman, quiet and unassuming, had become the linchpin in the cabin's survival. His plan would hinge on her continued calm, the passengers' compliance, and the hijackers' growing uncertainty. Time stretched. The plane hummed steadily. The hijackers shouted, waved, threatened, but nothing broke the rhythm the woman had established. Reynolds adjusted altitude slightly again, causing the lead hijacker to stumble, exposing the first real cracks in their confidence. The subtle power struggle was underway, invisible to most passengers, but pivotal in the unfolding drama. The cabin had become a silent battlefield of nerves and psychological strategy, where courage was the weapon and composure was the shield. Row 14 remained the eye of the storm. The woman's stillness, her whispered instructions, and her quiet presence kept the cabin tethered to hope. Every passenger who drew from her calm was a small victory. Every faltering hijacker a sign that the momentum had shifted. Reynolds took a deep breath, realizing the next phase of action had arrived. It would require precision, timing, and trust. In the passengers, trust in the woman who had become the unexpected leader, trust in his own instincts. For the first time since the hijacking began, he felt a glimmer of possibility. The passengers were ready, the hijackers were cracking, and a quiet, unwavering courage had taken hold. Flight 247 was no longer just a plane. It was a crucible of wills, and one woman's silent strength had changed everything. The cabin of Flight 247 was filled with a tension so thick it seemed almost tangible. Outside, the sun glimmered over endless stretches of clouds, a serene contrast to the storm brewing inside. The hijackers' movements grew more erratic. Their confidence dwindling, and the passengers slowly, carefully, were learning to feed off a new energy, quiet courage. All of it revolved around the woman in row 14. She had risen slightly from her seat, enough to project presence without drawing unnecessary attention. Her movements were precise, deliberate, almost ritualistic in their calmness. She leaned forward just enough to whisper instructions to nearby passengers. Keep your hands visible. Watch the others. Breathe slowly. Don't react to them. Her voice was soft, nearly imperceptible, yet it carried authority. Those closest to her followed without hesitation. Hands relaxed, chests expanded, shoulders straightened. A subtle rhythm emerged. Inhale, exhale, steady, steady. A 7-year-old boy mimicked her breathing, his grip on a toy car loosening. Adults nearby, sensing the shift, straightened as well, absorbing courage silently from the unassuming passenger, who had become the anchor of their survival. The lead hijacker, pacing near the front, observed the odd transformation in the cabin. His movements grew aggressive, exaggerated, yet less effective. He barked orders, demanding that passengers sit down, kneel, comply, but no one screamed. No one trembled uncontrollably. The terror he had expected to fuel his dominance was gone. He looked at his partners, realizing their confidence was wavering as well. One of the passengers near row 12, a construction worker, noticed the woman's composure and whispered to the person beside him, "Just follow her lead. Don't panic." The words were small, yet they carried weight. The recipient straightened and nodded. Soon, subtle murmurs of reassurance spread across other rows. Passengers were beginning to work as a quiet collective, guided by the unspoken authority of row 14. Captain Reynolds monitored every subtle shift from the cockpit. Through the cabin camera, he observed small but critical moments. The lead hijacker stumbling slightly, a middle passenger holding a chair tightly to steady himself, another swallowing audibly before following row 14's breathing rhythm. Reynolds realized that this was more than a battle of arms. It was a psychological struggle. The woman had seized the invisible leverage that fear gave the hijackers. Reynolds' mind raced. The subtle maneuvers of the plane, slight tilts, and minor altitude adjustments were enough to unbalance the hijackers without alarming the passengers. He could see the cracks forming. The middle hijacker dropped his weapon slightly as his knees shook. The rear hijacker muttered to himself, shifting his weight nervously. Every second, every minor hesitation, counted. The woman leaned slightly forward again, her eyes scanning the cabin. She identified potential threats, not just the hijackers' weapons, but also the reactions of passengers who might panic. She whispered instructions with surgical precision. Hold your hands steady, watch the others. Stay calm, one step at a time. Her guidance was invisible to the hijackers, yet its impact was immediate. Passengers began to subtly mirror her posture, her breathing, her deliberate calm. Small adjustments, straightening a back, resting hands on knees, controlled. Eye contact created a ripple effect. Each ripple amplified courage throughout the cabin. Even children, observing the stillness around them, ceased whimpering. The boy beside her, previously terrified, drew in a deep breath and exhaled, copying her rhythm. The hijackers noticed the subtle defiance. The lead yelled, waving his weapon more aggressively, trying to force compliance. But the controlled calm of the cabin absorbed his aggression, leaving him frustrated and increasingly vulnerable. His partners exchanged nervous glances, whispering under their breaths, unsure how to regain dominance. The woman observed these cracks. She had catalogued the hesitations, the stumbles, the tiny errors in coordination. Each one was an opportunity. Every slight imbalance was a chance to buy more time and increase the odds of survival. She wasn't rushing. She was calculating, a silent strategist in the middle of a high-stakes psychological war. Captain Reynolds recognized her strategy. He was impressed, aware that one passenger's quiet leadership was altering the dynamic entirely. He adjusted the plane again, banking slightly to maintain altitude, but subtly affecting the hijacker's stance. One stumbled, nearly tripping over the armrest. Another muttered a curse under his breath, revealing vulnerability. The balance had shifted, imperceptibly to the passengers, but clearly in the cockpit. The woman's influence extended beyond whispered instructions. She noticed the subtleties in body language, the slight tremor in a passenger's hand, The tension in a parent's jaw, the fear in a child's eyes. She adapted accordingly, whispering reassurances, directing focus, shielding vulnerable passengers. With her presence, each small act of guidance reinforced courage, further eroding the hijacker's control. A flight attendant, previously pale and shaking, caught the woman's approach and mirrored her calm. She began offering quiet reassurance, helping passengers adjust their positions and projecting composure. The ripple grew larger. The cabin was transforming into a collective unit, a web of silent resistance orchestrated by Row 14. The hijackers were becoming visibly frustrated. Their aggression increased, but effectiveness decreased. Commands were ignored, attempts to intimidate met only with steady eyes and controlled breathing. Fear, their primary weapon, was slipping through their fingers. Their movements became less coordinated, more panicked, and increasingly desperate. The woman noticed the growing disarray. She whispered to the nearest passengers, "Stay calm. Watch. Follow my lead. We can do this together." Her words were deliberate, strategic, and empowering. They weren't just instructions. They were a blueprint for psychological survival. Captain Reynolds adjusted the plane's altitude subtly again. Each maneuver was calculated, designed to keep the hijackers off balance while maintaining safety for the passengers. He knew the woman's calm was the linchpin of this operation. The moment she faltered, the psychological balance could collapse, but she did not. The cabin's tension transformed into a silent but coordinated vigilance. Passengers were no longer passive victims. They were participants, guided by Row 14's unshakable composure. Even the young boy beside the woman was alert but calm, following her breathing rhythm and watching her actions closely. The hijacker's confidence crumbled further. One stumbled while raising his weapon, nearly dropping it. Another muttered incoherently, attempting to coordinate with his partner. The lead, seeing the cracks, waved his weapon frantically, shouting orders that carried no weight. The cabin's collective calm had rendered their terror tactics ineffective. The woman observed every detail, noting weaknesses, calculating next steps, and ensuring passengers remained composed. She whispered again, "Watch them. Don't react. Focus on breathing, step by step." Her guidance was invisible to the hijackers, but critically impactful. Captain Reynolds leaned back slightly, observing the moment with relief. Fighter jets had been alerted, but the internal dynamics of the cabin were now paramount. The woman's quiet strategy was not just maintaining order, it was actively destabilizing the hijackers, buying crucial time for intervention. The balance of power had shifted. Fear no longer dominated the cabin. Courage, subtle and deliberate, had taken root. Row 14's quiet strategist had orchestrated the transformation. The hijackers were panicked, uncoordinated, and vulnerable. The passengers, inspired and guided, were prepared to survive. Flight 247 had become more than a plane in transit. It was now a carefully controlled battlefield of psychology and human willpower, with a single passenger serving as the linchpin of hope. The woman's calm, her strategic whispers, and her unwavering presence had changed the game entirely. Above the Rockies, the plane hummed steadily. Inside, passengers maintained focus, guided by Row 14. The hijackers, unprepared for such silent resistance, struggled to regain authority. Captain Reynolds prepared for the next phase, confident that the passengers were ready. The hijackers were destabilized, and the quiet strategy of one woman had created the conditions necessary for survival. Flight 247 had reached a precarious rhythm. Outside, the endless sky stretched blue and calm, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside the cabin. The hum of the engines provided a steady undertone, almost meditative, but the air was thick with tension. The hijackers had grown visibly frantic. Their aggression was more erratic, less coordinated, and their attempts to maintain control were faltering under the invisible authority of one woman in row 14. The woman had risen slightly from her seat, moving with careful deliberation. Her gaze swept the cabin, noting every subtle reaction, every micro-expression. Every passenger, every child, every adult had been drawn into her quiet orbit of calm. She whispered again, soft and precise, "Stay steady, breathe, watch me, follow my lead." Her instructions were almost imperceptible to the hijackers, yet their impact was profound. Passengers adjusted posture, steadied trembling hands, and synchronized their breathing with hers. Fear had not vanished, but courage had begun to dominate the cabin. Each small act of composure chipped away at the hijacker's psychological leverage. The lead hijacker, pacing near the front, noticed the unexpected defiance. He gestured wildly, shouting orders, but the passengers remained unmoved. His face tightened, jaw clenching as frustration turned to panic. His carefully rehearsed plan, reliant on visible fear, was collapsing before his eyes. The middle hijacker dropped his weapon slightly, startled by the subtle but persistent resistance of the passengers. His voice trembled as he attempted to coordinate with his partner. The rear hijacker whispered frantically, his movements jittery, betraying uncertainty. They were no longer operating as a unit. The silent, calculated calm of row 14 had dismantled their authority. The woman observed their faltering behavior. She leaned slightly toward nearby passengers, instructing them quietly, "If you see an opportunity, stay calm, step carefully, and help others." Her words were deliberate, preparing them for the moment when subtle action could be taken without provoking a violent response. The passengers absorbed her guidance like a silent mantra. Captain Reynolds in the cockpit monitored every detail through the cabin camera. The subtle shifts in the hijacker's behavior were unmistakable. One stumbled, another's grip on a weapon wavered, and the lead's vocal commands lost their effect. Reynolds adjusted the plane's altitude slightly, a small maneuver to unbalance the hijackers further without alarming the passengers. The stage was being set for decisive action. A young mother in row 13, inspired by the woman's calm, began to quietly help another passenger secure a fallen bag, moving with deliberate precision. A construction worker in row 12 shifted his stance, positioning himself subtly to shield a child if needed. These small gestures were unnoticed by the hijackers, but vital in reinforcing collective courage. A boy beside the woman, previously terrified, now mimicked her breathing, chest rising and falling steadily. His eyes met hers, a silent acknowledgement of trust and understanding. Around them, other passengers mirrored the rhythm. Inhale, exhale, hold steady. The cabin, once a theater of panic, had become a controlled, strategic environment. The lead hijacker slammed his weapon against the armrest in frustration. "Everyone obey," he shouted, voice cracking with tension. But the cabin responded. With quiet defiance, eyes met his in unwavering resolve. The woman's influence had created an unspoken solidarity among the passengers. Reynolds considered the next step. The subtle adjustments of altitude and tilt were proving effective, but external intervention was still minutes away. He needed the passengers ready for the crucial moment when coordinated action would be necessary. Timing had to be perfect. One wrong move could trigger violence. The woman whispered instructions to the nearest passengers, guiding them with precision. Step slowly if needed. Watch each other, support the scared, remain calm. Wait for the moment. Her words were strategic, fostering unity and preparing them mentally for the action to come. The hijacker's coordination deteriorated rapidly. The middle man fumbled. A weapon, his hands shaking. The rear man's whispering turned into muttered panic. The lead was yelling louder, more aggressively, but his control had evaporated. The cabin's silent defiance had rendered their threats ineffective. Passengers began to act in small, calculated ways. A teenager in row 11 adjusted a seat to shield a nearby child. An elderly man leaned forward subtly, signaling readiness. To assist, a nurse whispered instructions to a mother, helping her calm her child. Each small act was invisible to the hijackers, but vital in establishing an organized response. The woman in row 14 remained the center of this silent coordination. She shifted slightly, moving toward the aisle without drawing attention. Her eyes scanned the cabin, noting potential obstacles and vulnerable passengers. She whispered guidance. "Observe the others. Stay calm. Follow my lead." One step at a time, her strategy was working. The hijackers were losing control, increasingly reactive, while the passengers grew steadier. The psychological balance had shifted completely. The fear that had once ruled the cabin was now overshadowed by deliberate, calm readiness. Captain Reynolds noted the exact moment when the first hijacker stumbled noticeably. He pressed a discreet button to adjust the plane's tilt slightly, further destabilizing the intruder without alarming the passengers. The hijacker's voice rose in panic, commands shouted faster, less effectively. His partners were following his cues poorly, creating discord among the three. The woman seized the moment to prepare the passengers for coordinated action. She whispered to a small group near her, "Stay calm. When I give the signal, help others quietly, hold steady, and keep control." The words were soft but powerful. Her authority was absolute, and the passengers responded without hesitation. A wave of collective courage spread. The boy beside her mirrored her breathing perfectly. Adults straightened their posture, eyes sharp, hands steady. Children looked to the adults, drawing strength from their calm. The cabin had transformed into a coordinated unit, led by one woman whose presence had become magnetic. The lead hijacker noticed the coordinated posture, the synchronized calm. Confusion flickered across his face. He gestured wildly, trying to command compliance, but the effect was minimal. His authority, rooted in fear, was evaporating. The woman leaned slightly forward, whispering guidance to the passengers. "Help those who hesitate. Watch each other. Stay calm. Support quietly." These instructions reinforced collective readiness, creating a mental framework for action without provoking immediate violence. Captain Reynolds adjusted the plane's altitude and tilt again, subtle enough to be imperceptible to the passengers, but enough to unsettle the hijackers further. One stumbled, nearly dropping a weapon. Another muttered incoherently, panic creeping in. The lead was shouting commands that no longer carried authority. The passengers were ready. The woman had transformed them from terrified victims into a silent, coordinated force. Fear had been replaced with awareness and deliberate calm. Every subtle gesture, every controlled breath, every whispered instruction had prepared them for the decisive moment. The hijackers' panic reached a critical point. Their movements were jerky, erratic, and uncoordinated. The lead waved a weapon, frantically, but it carried no threat. The middle and rear men were visibly trembling. The psychological leverage they had relied upon was gone. Row 14 remained the epicenter of calm. The woman's eyes scanned the cabin, ensuring readiness, assessing vulnerabilities, and preparing to guide the passengers through the next phase. The boy beside her held her hand briefly, a gesture of trust. She nodded subtly, acknowledging him, reinforcing the collective calm. Captain Reynolds watched with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The cabin had shifted from chaos to controlled anticipation. The hijackers were destabilized. The passengers, guided by row 14, were ready to act with coordinated precision. Flight 247 had crossed the threshold. The hijackers no longer commanded fear, they were vulnerable. The passengers, under the quiet leadership of one woman, had transformed into a silent, strategic force. The moment of action was near. The cabin of Flight 247 was silent, but the silence was electric. Every passenger was aware of the precarious balance of power, every eye scanning, every hand resting lightly on an armrest or bag, every breath controlled. The hijackers were afraid, their confidence crumbling, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. They no longer commanded fear, they were cornered, vulnerable, and growing desperate. The woman in row 14 shifted her weight slightly, standing taller, projecting calm authority. Her eyes swept the cabin, locking briefly with several passengers. A silent signal. The moment had come. Her instructions, whispered throughout the past tense minutes, had prepared everyone for this instant. She whispered softly, "One step at a time. Stay calm. Follow my lead." Passengers obeyed, hearts pounding, muscles tense. Children held tight to adults, adults straightened, gripping whatever could be used for defense if needed. Small gestures, feet planted firmly, hands steady, eyes alert, created a unified force without a word spoken aloud. The hijackers, still unaware of the impending coordination, fumbled with their weapons, muttering among themselves, unaware that their control had evaporated. Captain Reynolds observed from the cockpit, calculating every possible outcome. The hijackers were vulnerable, but he could not intervene directly without risking passenger safety. The woman's leadership inside the cabin had created the opening. Timing, precision, and composure were everything. One misstep could trigger a violent response, yet every passenger was ready to act under her guidance. The lead hijacker shouted, waving his weapon frantically, "Everyone sit. Obey me." But the cabin remained still. Eyes met his with quiet defiance. The middle hijacker staggered slightly, losing balance, while the rear muttered incoherently, trying to coordinate with his partners. Their carefully rehearsed plan had unraveled. The woman leaned slightly forward, whispering instructions to a small cluster near her. "Now, step quietly, one at a time. Help the scared. Control your movements. Move together." Her voice was barely audible, yet it carried authority, focus, and clarity. The passengers absorbed her words, muscles coiling in preparation for action. A subtle rhythm began to emerge. Those closest to the hijackers in the front rows would distract them, while others positioned themselves to subdue them if necessary. Every motion was deliberate. Panic was absent. Precision dominated. The cabin had become a silent, coordinated force, guided entirely by row 14 strategist. The lead hijacker, noticing the unusual calm, waved his weapon more aggressively. But his gestures lacked conviction. His voice cracked as he shouted, realizing for the first time that fear no longer flowed through the passengers. The middle hijacker fumbled with a dropped magazine, muttering under his breath, while the rear whispered frantic, incoherent orders. Their psychological leverage was gone. The woman stepped slightly to the aisle, her movements controlled, measured, unthreatening. She whispered, "Step forward slowly. Watch each other. Hold steady." Passengers obeyed. Adults moved carefully toward the hijackers, shielding children, gripping armrests, and coordinating subtly. The young boy beside her, mimicking her breathing, glanced at her for reassurance. She nodded. He steadied himself. The lead hijacker attempted to raise his weapon, but the coordinated pressure of calm, deliberate passengers disrupted his focus. A middle-aged man, guided by row 14, moved swiftly, yet cautiously, stepping to intercept. The lead jerked backward slightly, startled. Another passenger, a nurse, positioned herself to aid any injured or obstructed. Every movement was deliberate, calculated, unhurried, designed to minimize risk. Captain Reynolds monitored every detail. Heart pounding. He could see the cracks widening. The hijackers' panic was tangible. Their once commanding movements had become uncoordinated, hesitant. One misstep, one moment of distraction, could give passengers the upper hand. The woman whispered instructions again, coordinating small groups, one at a time. Stay calm, support each other, move toward the front. Don't rush, wait for my cue. Her words, almost imperceptible, orchestrated the cabin like a silent conductor. Passengers mirrored her calm, synchronized their movements, and positioned themselves strategically. The lead hijacker swung his weapon toward a passenger, attempting to step forward. But the combined presence of several calm, deliberate adults created a psychological barrier. His confidence wavered, his gestures frantic but ineffective. The middle hijacker lost balance completely, staggering into the aisle, while the rear muttered frantically, losing control of his weapon. The first decisive action came from a construction worker in row 12. He stepped quickly, but carefully, moving toward the middle hijacker who had lost balance. The woman in row 14 whispered guidance to him. Steady. Watch your footing. Don't provoke. Subdue quietly. He moved with controlled precision, gripping the man's arm and redirecting the weapon toward the floor. The middle hijacker froze, caught off guard by the sudden coordinated calm. The lead hijacker attempted to regain control, but his shouting no longer commanded fear. A teacher in row 10 stepped forward, guided by the woman's quiet cues, positioning herself between the hijacker and a group of children. Calm and deliberate, she blocked his path, redirecting his attention without provoking aggression. The rear hijacker, realizing the loss of coordination among his partners, muttered incoherently and took a step backward. A flight attendant, inspired by row 14, quietly guided passengers to form a protective barrier around the more vulnerable, while maintaining calm composure. The hijackers were disoriented, trapped in a psychological maze crafted by one woman and followed silently by every passenger. The woman whispered again, "Move together. Help the scared. One step, stay calm." Each phrase was a lifeline. Passengers followed precisely, moving in a synchronized flow toward the hijackers. The lead waved his weapon, but hesitation flickered across his face. The middle, struggling, was grabbed by multiple coordinated hands. The rear backed against the wall, realizing escape was impossible. Captain Reynolds adjusted the plane subtly, tilting slightly to maintain balance, but ensuring the hijackers' footing was uncertain. It was a small but critical advantage. One by one, passengers applied gentle, controlled pressure, restraining the hijackers without escalating violence. The final moment arrived when the woman gave the subtle cue, a small nod toward the nearest passengers. In unison, they moved decisively. The lead hijacker was subdued first, disarmed carefully, hands pinned behind him by coordinated movements. The middle was restrained next, struggling briefly, but overpowered by calm, precise passenger action. The rear, isolated and panicked, fell easily into the control of the group. Silence filled the cabin once more, but it was different from the tense silence before. It was a controlled, triumphant quiet. The hijackers were restrained, unable to influence the passengers further. The woman in row 14 returned to her seat, still calm, still composed, but her eyes scanned the cabin, ensuring safety. The boy beside her exhaled slowly, a small smile of relief forming. Captain Reynolds exhaled in the cockpit. Through a combination of psychological insight, subtle maneuvering, and the extraordinary courage of one passenger, the crisis had been neutralized internally. Fighter jets were still on alert, but the immediate threat had been contained. Passengers, shaking but relieved, began whispering quietly among themselves, acknowledging the woman's leadership. The flight attendants moved swiftly to secure the cabin, checking for injuries, offering water, and restoring order. Yet everyone knew the pivotal force had been Row 14, the woman whose calm had orchestrated courage, strategy, and survival. Hijackers were pinned against seats, disarmed and silent. Their plan had collapsed under the collective composure of ordinary passengers, guided by extraordinary leadership. The cabin had transformed from a scene of chaos into a testament to courage, strategy, and human resilience. For Reynolds, the lesson was clear. One person's unwavering calm could change the course of events entirely. For the passengers, the moment was both terrifying and triumphant, proof that courage, unity, and quiet leadership could prevail against terror. Flight 247 continued toward its destination, engine steady, passengers recovering, hijackers restrained. Outside, the sky remained calm, the sunlight glinting over the clouds, a stark contrast to the storm the passengers had survived within. Row 14 remained a focal point, the woman finally relaxing slightly, though her vigilance never wavered entirely. Her calm had turned the tide, and her quiet strategy had saved lives. The boy beside her rested his head against her arm, the first visible sign of relief spreading through the cabin. The plane had been transformed into a battlefield of willpower, strategy, and courage. And the woman in Row 14 had emerged as the unsung hero, guiding passengers through terror with nothing more than composure, clarity, and quiet authority. The tension inside Flight 247 had finally dissipated, replaced with a cautious sense of relief. The hijackers were restrained, their desperate attempts at control neutralized by the coordinated, quiet courage of the passengers, guided by the woman in Row 14. Engines hummed steadily, a gentle contrast to the storm that had raged inside the cabin hours before. The plane's descent toward the nearest safe airport was smooth, meticulously controlled by Captain Reynolds and his co-pilot, whose eyes remained fixed on the instruments, but whose mind lingered on the extraordinary events that had just unfolded. Passengers remained tense, but fear had been replaced with awe, curiosity, and gratitude. Children clung to their parents, their small bodies trembling from adrenaline, yet their eyes were wide, observing the calm determination that had guided them through the chaos. Adults whispered softly, recounting in hushed tones the precise moments when courage had overtaken panic, when the lead hijacker had faltered under the collective composure of ordinary people. The woman in Row 14 finally allowed herself a deep breath. She leaned back in her seat, though her eyes never left the cabin. Every movement, every expression, every faint whimper or sigh of relief was catalogued in her mind. She had guided the passengers through terror, orchestrated a subtle, strategic resistance, and ensured the safety of every soul aboard without raising her voice or displaying overt heroics. Her quiet presence had been the linchpin of survival. Captain Reynolds spoke quietly into the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, the immediate danger has passed. Please remain seated and follow the instructions of the flight crew. We are preparing to land safely. You have shown extraordinary courage and composure under extreme circumstances." His words, measured but sincere, were met with murmurs of relief and soft applause. Passengers began checking on each other. A mother in Row 13 comforted her child. A man in Row 12 assisted an elderly passenger who had trembled throughout the ordeal, and another passenger offered water and support to those still visibly shaken. Every act was small, but every gesture reinforced the bonds formed in the crucible of terror. The woman in Row 14 quietly monitored the movements, ensuring no one panicked as the plane prepared for landing. The hijackers, now fully restrained, sat in stunned silence. Their plan had collapsed completely. They had underestimated the collective resilience of the passengers and the extraordinary influence of one unassuming woman. Their confidence had evaporated, replaced with confusion, fear, and the stark realization of their failure. Captain Reynolds maintained a steady hand on the controls. His mind reflected on the psychological dynamics he had witnessed, the profound effect one individual could have in shaping the outcome of a high-stakes crisis. Every decision, every adjustment, every subtle shift of the plane had been timed to complement the woman's leadership in the cabin. Without her, the outcome could have been catastrophic. As the plane descended toward the runway, the passengers collectively exhaled, some clutching each other in relief, some closing their eyes, still processing the adrenaline coursing through their veins. The cabin lights reflected softly off the polished surfaces, and outside, the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting warm, golden rays across the airport tarmac. The plane touched down with a controlled, gentle thud. The brakes hissed, engines powered down, and the aircraft slowed to a halt. Flight attendants moved quickly, instructing passengers to remain calm and follow evacuation protocols if necessary. There was no panic, no chaos, only a quiet, collective acknowledgement of survival and relief. Passengers began murmuring to one another, recounting their experiences in soft tones. "Did you see how calm she stayed?" whispered one man to his neighbor. "I wouldn't have made it without her guidance," replied another. Stories of bravery, composure, and strategic thinking spread through the cabin like wildfire, centering on the woman who had changed the course of events with nothing more than her calm presence. Flight crew members approached row 14, their faces a mixture of admiration and gratitude. "Ma'am, your composure saved lives," said the lead flight attendant. "We don't know what would have happened without your leadership." The woman nodded quietly, almost dismissively, but her eyes betrayed a deep sense of responsibility and awareness of the lives she had helped protect. The passengers themselves formed a circle of acknowledgement around her, offering nods, whispers of thanks, and gentle applause. Even the children, once terrified, looked toward her with a mixture of reverence and relief. The woman finally allowed herself a small, genuine smile. She had guided them all, ensured their safety, and maintained composure when every instinct screamed panic. Authorities arrived swiftly. Airport security and emergency responders boarded the plane, quickly taking the hijackers into custody. The restrained men were escorted off the aircraft, their plan thwarted, their arrogance shattered by the collective courage of ordinary passengers and the extraordinary calm of one woman. The passengers were briefed, medical personnel attended to anyone needing attention, and the cabin atmosphere, though still tense, was steadily transforming into relief and triumph. Captain Reynolds debriefed with the authorities, recounting the psychological dynamics he had witnessed and praising the woman for her pivotal role. Her ability to maintain calm, coordinate passengers, and subtly orchestrate the subduing of the hijackers had been instrumental in the survival of every individual aboard. Media crews quickly arrived, and the story of Flight 247 began spreading. Passengers recounted their experiences, the bravery of their fellow travelers, and the extraordinary calm of the woman in row 14. News headlines praised her composure, leadership, and the way she had transformed fear into coordinated action, ensuring the plane's safe landing and saving countless lives. Interviewers approached her later, but she remained composed, almost hesitant to accept the spotlight. "I just did what anyone would have done," she said quietly. Yet everyone knew the truth. Her extraordinary ability to lead silently, to instill courage without force or threat, had been the difference between disaster and survival. Passengers continued sharing stories. Some recalled the subtle guidance she had given them, the whispered instructions that kept them focused. Others spoke of her calm presence, how it radiated across the cabin, uniting them in silent defiance against terror. Children pointed to her, still wide-eyed, as if recognizing a hero in their midst. Captain Reynolds personally approached her. "Ma'am, I've flown thousands of hours and faced situations I never imagined, but I've never seen courage and leadership like yours. You changed the course of this flight." She nodded, humble yet steadfast, understanding that her actions had created a ripple effect that ensured the safety of everyone aboard. As passengers disembarked, there was a sense of shared relief and unspoken admiration. Stories would be told, retold, and remembered. Flight 247 had become a testament to human courage, resilience, and the extraordinary impact of one calm, strategic individual. The woman in row 14 finally stood, shoulders relaxed, walking slowly down the aisle. Passengers nodded, whispered thanks, and offered smiles of gratitude. She moved quietly, without fanfare, yet every step was a reminder of the extraordinary human capacity to influence outcomes through calm, focus, and courage. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the tarmac. Emergency vehicles departed, the hijackers were taken into custody, and the airport returned to its normal rhythm. Yet for those who had survived Flight 247, nothing would ever be the same. They had witnessed firsthand the power of calm leadership, of coordinated courage, and of an unassuming woman who had changed the course of events with nothing more than her presence, intelligence, and unwavering composure. For Captain Reynolds, the flight crew, and every passenger aboard, the lesson was clear. Courage is contagious, composure is powerful, and one person's calm can change the course of history. And for the woman in row 14, the moment was quietly transformative, an affirmation that ordinary individuals, under extraordinary circumstances, can become the pivot around which fate turns. Flight 247 was more than a plane. It was a story of survival, strategy, and human resilience. And at its heart was a woman whose quiet strength had ensured that the lives of dozens were preserved, that terror was neutralized, and that the ordinary became heroic through composure, courage, and the quiet power of presence.